Okay, let's go ahead and get started. You know, when we scheduled this event for February 25th, I was pretty concerned that the weather might lead to really, really low turnout. But I didn't imagine that like beautiful weather might be a reason not to turn out because people might want to be outside. And even worse, like there's no room on campus where you can better get a sense of what you're missing by not being out in the sunshine by being here. So hand on heart, thank you guys so much for coming out for this event. We've been really excited about this for a long time. Really looking forward to the conversation. So I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies here at the International Institute. Welcome to everybody who's here, both in person and online. And I want to just note this event is co-sponsored today by the Year of Democracy program, and they've done a wonderful job of helping us put this all together. So our theme today, so after 2024, elections and democracy. And let me just briefly read you the description that we have, and this is the prompts that our speakers were given, so this will be what we'll be talking about. So 2024 was described as a super year for elections, but for many people in many places, it didn't feel like a super year for democracy. This roundtable takes stock of what we learned from a year when a whopping 4 billion people, half the world's population, from America to India to Mexico to South Africa, had the opportunity to vote. Are elections mostly fulfilling their democratic promise or increasingly ushering authoritarian politicians into power? And what beyond elections is most urgently needed to strengthen global democracy in the years to come? So now, in the interest of time, I'm going to give very highly truncated introductions of our esteemed panelists. So Pratap Mehta is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguishing Teaching at Princeton University. He was previously Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University and President of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. He has published widely in political theory, history of ideas, Indian constitutional law, and politics in India. His forthcoming work looks at philosophical ideas about religion in 20th century India. Didi is a Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. She's a scholar of comparative politics with a focus on democratization, corruption and clientelism, political parties and institutions, and political reform. She's the author of The Great Retreat, How Political Parties Should Behave and Why They Don't, from Oxford University Press. And just a little plug for that, so tomorrow downstairs at our center, she'll be giving a book talk, and Rob Mickey will be responding on that. So please do think about coming for that as well. Ann Pitcher is the Joel Samoff Collegiate Professor of Political Science and Afro-American and African Studies here at Michigan. Professor Pitcher's research comparatively examines the political economy of urban residential development, the distribution of goods under authoritarianism, and the role of regulatory agencies in Africa. She has undertaken extensive fieldwork in Mozambique, Angola, South Africa, and Zambia. Also my colleague, Vincent Hutchings, is the Professor of Diversity and Social Transformation and the Haynes Walton Jr. Collegiate Professor of Political Science and Afro-American and African Studies. Professor Hutchings' general interests include public opinion, elections, voting behavior, and African-American politics. He recently published a book with Princeton University Press entitled Public Opinion and Democratic Accountability, How Citizens Learn About Politics. And I should also note at the outset, we're sorry, Steve Levitsky was supposed to be here from Harvard, but had to eventually decline for family reasons. So we're sorry not to have Steve here with us today. I want to turn it over to our panelists starting now. So we're going to go in the order of rotation here. So Didi's going to speak first, and then if you're online, you'll have a chance you can use the Q&A function to ask questions, and I'll be fielding questions at the end. So thank you again so much for being here. Didi?
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you Dan and the University of Michigan for sponsoring this great event. It's hard to summarize everything that happened in 2024, so I'm going to try to kind of contextualize the 2024 elections against some broader democratic trends, focus on three in particular that I think these elections accelerate, which have to do with a crisis of representation, a decline of the sort of neoliberal economic consensus, and finally a changing environment for information, the sort of media ecosystem. And more importantly, I'll be focusing on the advanced democracies, but I really look forward to learning about elections in other parts of the world from our fellow panelists. So this year, or last year in 2024, let's go all the way back to the 1990s. At the end of the Cold War, there was kind of a consensus after the end of the Cold War that political and market liberalization were the best way to create peace and prosperity globally. And as a result, many different institutions and national governments came together to facilitate the transition to democracy around the world and also the integration of economic systems. We saw the number of democracies rise over the course of the 1990s, and into the 21st century. But in 2005, global democracy watchdogs noted that democracy kind of stalled. And as of 2024, we had been in 19 years of what my colleague at Stanford, Larry Diamond, calls a democratic recession, meaning the number of democracies has not been on the rise, but is instead stagnant, and indicators of the quality of democracy within democracies has been on the decline. So in those 19 years, a lot happened. There were two huge global shocks in the form of the financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic, both of which accelerated citizens' distrust of their government. There's been a rise in an assertive authoritarianism from Russia's Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping, which threatened geopolitical stability, at least in their regions. And finally, there's been ongoing public discontent. We know this because people say they don't trust their governments. There's been more contentious politics and mass protests, which have been on the rise since 2017. Now, if we think just of the Western democracies, what are often called the advanced or long-standing democracies, there's been a long-standing question of it can't happen here. And in fact, those countries have served as the model towards which other countries aspire. But we've also seen rising populism and illiberalism in those countries. In 2024, there were a few election trends, not huge takeaways, but a few trends. One is that the far right continued to do well in national elections in Europe. The Freedom Party of Austria, the National Rally in France, and this week, the AfD in Germany, Dan was there, have done better than predicted in the polls. However, there have also been signs of pushback. In Poland, where the longstanding Law and Justice Party had a governing majority, they finally lost last year due to a coalition of opposition parties and civil society actors that came together. Also, at the last minute, broader inroads by the National Rally in France were prevented by, again, a coalition of parties led by Emmanuel Macron. In Britain, the Labour Party won after many years of conservative power, although the Reform UK Party of Nigel Farage also did do well, and Nigel Farage has now been elected to Parliament. And in elections to the European Parliament, the kind of EU elections, the centre held, with parties of the European People's Parties of the centre left and centre right continuing to do the best in elections, but parties of the left lost ground, while parties of the right, including the group Patriots for Europe, which are far-right parties, did the second best. They're now the third largest group of parties in the EP. So kind of the takeaways here are that it's a mixed bag. The far right, I should say also that in 2024, in the American elections, President Trump won. Now, this was not a sort of typical election between a Republican and Democratic candidate, but the far right is not the same across the countries. However, they're united by some similar values: a rejection of cultural pluralism, a rejection of policies around diversity, those that might benefit racial minorities, women, or those with different sexual identities. They have a softer stance on Russia, and they tend to have kind of a xenophobic nationalist streak and a rejection of people who are not like us. But there are also counter-trends that make us hopeful about democracy. First, there were many widespread anti-AfD protests at the beginning of last year. There were, again, the elections in France and Poland, in which kind of pro-democracy coalitions were able to come together. Presidents who tried overreach in Brazil and Korea were held accountable. And finally, there were widespread pro-democracy protests in places like Venezuela and Georgia, where there were fraudulent election results that still stand today, but we still see people who want their freedom and are willing to fight for it. So what are the three trends, or what are we going to be looking for after this momentous year of elections? The first is, despite the fact that people still support democracy and want it as a form of government, they're dissatisfied with the way democracy operates. There has been a long-standing kind of problem with responsiveness among the mainstream political parties of the left and right in the long-standing democracies. Increasingly, people are unwilling to identify with parties. Party membership has reached historic lows in Western Europe. People in the United States increasingly reject both the Republican and Democratic parties, despite the fact that we've been polarized for a long time. Over 40% of Americans of plurality identify as independents. More and more people say that no party represents them and that they can't trust any party to kind of implement the public good. And this is a problem for democracies. It's usually the case that people feel they have some say when they go to the ballot box. But when people feel as if nothing they choose is going to make a bit of difference, or they feel like they don't really have a sense of efficacy or anyone who's going to respond to their needs, they might turn away from democracy more broadly. So in the United States, that presents, and around the advanced democratic world, that presents opportunities for extremists and outsiders to come to power, sometimes through taking over an existing party, like the Republican Party in the United States, which I think President Trump has very effectively managed to do since 2016, or alternatively by starting new parties, like those in the parliamentary systems of Western Europe. The second trend is a breakdown of this neoliberal economic consensus that I mentioned before. After the 1990s, there was a kind of cross-partisan consensus about the kind of policies you needed to sustain economic growth. So parties at the left and right tended to agree that you needed deregulation, lower corporate taxes, and economic integration through free trade. So the WTO, NAFTA, the EU itself, these were all projects that were sort of begun and sort of like consolidated in the 1990s. And the underlying idea is that the free movement of goods, capital, and people is going to be net beneficial for everyone. But it turns out domestic societies don't think that's the case. There have been winners and losers from globalization. Some industries have declined, like traditional manufacturing, at least in the advanced economies, while the sectors that have grown, like finance and tech, benefit a small segment of highly skilled laborers and generate more economic inequality through the domestic economy. There's also been a growing sort of precarity in the labor market, a gigification of jobs, for example, a rising cost of living, and an austerity or reduction in the social spending and social policies that once provided a safety net for people. So when the cost of living rises while opportunities decline, it's not surprising that people feel as if they're not represented or the government isn't doing something to help them. No mainstream party seems to offer a compelling alternative to this neoliberal consensus, although we now see a rise in a rejection of free trade through Trump's tariffs, for example. And further, beyond sort of economics, there's also been a degradation of the liberal international order, which was long sustained by global support from the West for democratic institutions worldwide. We've seen many countries enact foreign agent laws that kick out Western NGOs that are trying to promote democracy. And now we've seen President Trump and Elon Musk, under the auspices of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, go after the democracy promotion institutions of the United States government, the National Endowment for Democracy, many of the NGOs that support democracy. And that is a problem in that if fewer and fewer people, especially in the West, think that we need to help sustain political democracy around the world, then it's very likely to lead to less global support for democracy. Finally, there have been changes to the information ecosystem that we're all familiar with. But if we were here in 2016 or 2017, we talk about misinformation and disinformation and like, what is Facebook going to do about the Macedonian teenagers who make up news headlines? Whereas now it seems like we actually face a completely alternative information environment. The rise of alternative media in the form of what my students tell me is called the manosphere. I don't really know what it is. But we know that people seek information and receive information from very different sources. These are not sort of vetted media members of a media elite, but rather there's a real decentralization and access of information that we used to think was good, like the more information the better, but now we realize can be problematic because there aren't necessarily checks on that kind of information. We know that President Trump, for example, didn't use a traditional ground game the way that Kamala Harris had organized her supporters and donors to do, but he was able to succeed massively through speaking directly to a lot of voters through these alternative channels. And that's, in fact, how many far-right parties organize. They start out with a lot of digital support or online activism before they mobilize a real ground game like a traditional political party. It also becomes easier to mobilize transnational political sentiment through this alternative media ecosystem. We've seen Elon Musk tweet his support, for example, of the AfD and of Nigel Farage's party. And there's a problem of independent media itself. In places like Central and Eastern Europe, independent media, which is long seen as a check on democracy or within democracy, is increasingly owned by private actors who may be closely affiliated with the government. So this rise of sort of oligarchic ownership of independent media, and we might see glimmers of that in the United States with Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post, editors who have discretion over the kinds of stories that are run or the kinds of topics that they're willing to cover, is also a problem for democracy. So to quickly conclude, the takeaway is that institutions might be more vulnerable and more fragile than we thought. We've taken them for granted for a long time. But the rule of law is not self-enforcing, and the institutions are composed of individuals who, if you switch them out, the institutions can act in fundamentally different ways. The takeaway is not that democracy is ending or even hugely at threat, but it's that we need to do a lot more as citizens to activate our own sources of democratic legitimacy and to fight back against any possible erosion of rights. Thanks.
Thank you to the organizer. It's a great privilege to be here, and thank you all for coming. So what I'll do is just offer some provocations to kind of get a conversation going that's perhaps a bit more comparative and, last speaker's kind of hard act to follow. And my story, in a sense, will come to the same conclusion, but through a kind of different pathway. So India had a general election, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party received a minor setback. It lost its absolute majority in parliament. And people thought this was a little crack through which the light of the opposition is finally beginning to kind of filter in. But actually, just within a couple of months, that crack closed. There was a bunch of state elections. And it is fair to say that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the BJP, which is a right-wing nationalist party, has actually consolidated its power even more strongly than they had in their previous term. Okay. Now, what kinds of questions does this raise? And I'm going to kind of put these questions in a kind of comparative frame. So question number one, like in the United States to a certain extent, the opposition ran on the slogan, democracy will be in danger if Narendra Modi wins again. Just like Kamala Harris kind of did, right? Democracy is in danger. And one of the interesting questions is, this democracy in danger argument does not seem to have been sufficient almost anywhere significantly to actually dent the right-wing hegemony, right? And so we have to ask a hard question about ourselves. What is going on here? Is there more support for authoritarianism? There's some evidence for that. Or are there two conflicting meanings of democracy actually at stake? So when we think of democracy, we think of checks and balances, protection of individual rights, institutional processes. But I think democracies are at this moment in the world where a lot of people, right, think that those are exactly the kind of institutional contrivances that allow elites to hijack democracy. And that democracy is fundamentally about expressing the collective agency of the people, which might be embodied in a party, which might be embodied in an individual. And that agency cannot be fully expressed if you think of checks and balances in the kind of conventional kind of way. And so it's not an accident that basically every one of these movements, whether it's kind of Prime Minister Narendra Modi or Donald Trump, actually run against some structurally old regime, right? You call it liberal, centrist regime that they think is exactly the kind of regime that was thwarting the will of the people. And so, I think that raises kind of interesting challenges for us in terms of how we actually think about democracy. And it's not going to be sufficient to simply say democracy is in danger. The second interesting thing about, I think, the Indian case, and is a political point, and since we are in Michigan, again, I'm throwing it out as a kind of question to be discussed comparatively. Demography is not political destiny. What do I mean by that? So when we think of center and left parties in India, right, they broadly had three arguments on which they were running. One is democracy in danger, right? The second is we'll restore the status quo ante. And frankly, the status quo ante will simply not cut it. I mean, it's like trying to restore the Bourbon monarchy after the French Revolution, right? But that's where the center and left is for the most part. But the third political strategy which they've crafted was looking upon society as composed of relatively naturalized demographic groups. In the case of India, caste, which has always been a kind of cross-cutting cleavage that we historically thought would check Hindu nationalism, right? And a reliance on those naturalized cross-cutting cleavages has simply not worked. to put it a little bit more provocatively, the left and center have become much more essentialized about identity in politics, whereas the right has a much more generative conception of politics, which is to say, through the activity of actually mobilization, information, re-articulation, you can actually break down these naturalized identities and actually create something different, right? And so whether it's race, whether it's gender, the kind of lines of voting did not go the way in which the center-left thought it would, actually. So women support Narendra Modi very highly. He's dented the lower caste base, and largely through the generative conception of politics. And I think this is a kind of interesting challenge for center and left parties, which is if all we rely on is like a calculus of social groups, as if they are these naturalized social identities whose political behavior you can predict, you're actually not going to have a very effective politics. Right? The third comparative, I guess, observation, proposition on the table, and here I may kind of, in a sense, depart from Didi's kind of wonderful narrative, which is about the politics of neoliberalism. So coming from India, and I suspect this is true broadly coming from Asia, maybe broadly, the Western narrative on neoliberalism is actually a little bit jarring. It's a bit jarring in the sense that this era of neoliberalism, broadly speaking, the post-end of history era, 1989 to 2009 financial crisis, actually in much of the global south is a golden era of state building and the expansion of the welfare state, the creation of unprecedented state capacity, at least compared to their own historical experience, right? And this is actually one thing the right has been very good at. I mean, both parties in India, Congress actually started that process, right? So in India, the standard story can't be that this is a kind of revolt against neoliberalism. And in fact, one of the things about Mr. Modi's government, if you look at his kind of coalition, is that it's this interesting coalition where his model of growth has actually benefited the top 20, 30% disproportionately. So there is rising inequality. But he's been able to compensate for that by actually building out a welfare coalition at the bottom and a kind of unprecedented expansion of the welfare state. Where the Indian economy is stuck is actually in the middle. So if you took the kind of middle 40 to 50%, there seems to be a kind of structural cul-de-sac where you don't have rising wages, where you don't have kind of expanding employment opportunities. And the interesting question is whether this coalition of extremes in some ways, right, which is oligarchy at the top and kind of welfare populism at the bottom, whether this is actually an economic coalition you can sustain for a very long time, particularly if you can get maybe up to 6 to 7% growth, right? So I think, I think I agree with Professor Crow's point that in some senses, you are at a conjuncture where political parties across the world are struggling to figure out what kind of replaces that post-end of history neoliberalism moment. But I think this is a struggle that actually cuts across all political parties. But in countries like India, where for a variety of reasons, you can take about 5 to 6% growth at the lower bound for granted, actually it's a pretty sustainable growth rate for actually a right kind of coalition. The fourth comparative point I'd say, and this I now kind of believe even more strongly, which is in most of the cases that we have seen where elections took place, ultimately, if you want to save democracy, you have to do the hard work of politics. One of the things we have discovered is that reliance on formal checks and balances, constitutional contrivances, independent judiciaries, independent regulatory bodies, independent election commissions, those are actually very, very weak supports for democracy if there is genuine populist pressure. I mean, as Learned Hand used to say, right, if you're looking to the courts to save democracy, your democracy is already lost, right? And in some ways, wherever there has been a kind of pullback from the brink, arguably from Poland and so forth, it has actually been because the center and the left, or whatever that alternative is, has managed to at least contingently carve out some kind of electoral victory. Okay? And to my mind, the central element of that victory is for the center and left parties to be able to send a signal that they are actually capable of governing. I think one of the big crises in India is that Mr. Modi's economic record is middling. He's a capable macroeconomic manager. He's actually not bad at building out state capacity. But it's much harder to convince the electorate that the center and the left are actually capable of governing. And I suspect something like that was at work in the United States as well at the margins, right? And so the question is, how do you actually send the signal when you're not in power? And that's, I think, a mobilizational dilemma for the center and the left. I'll just quickly end with sort of two more small points. One about the form of political mobilizing. Again, picking up on something Professor Kuo said about the information order. There is no question that all our democracies are struggling to confront the character of our information order. I mean, it's like the printing revolution, in the 15th, 16th centuries. All kinds of authorities are, in a sense, imploding under the barrage of skepticism, in part because this information order, in a sense, allows doubt to spread much more easily, right? But I would actually caution about putting too much weight on this argument about the information order. And my evidence for this is actually India's BJP. So we all say, look, the BJP controls the media, it controls social media allows Prime Minister Modi to directly communicate with 1 billion people. But what's interesting about their electoral strategy? They don't believe that entirely. So if you look at the BJP's comeback, one of the remarkable things about it was how much old-fashioned politics they did. They get a slight setback in the national elections. The next state elections, their civil society organization, RSS, organizes in one state 60,000 town hall meetings. So there is an incredible face-to-face, old-fashioned mobilization that the right has also been engaging in, right? And I think it's actually completely, in a sense, I think, outsmarting and outwitting the left and center on this. I think the left and center is actually, I think it's too comforting a thought to say it's just all social media. I think it is important, I think, in creating the conditions of a certain kind of nihilism as a backdrop against which the right flourishes. But you actually need good old-fashioned mobilizing. And the last and final kind of obvious point in some senses that one big theme in all the elections that we've seen practically was the resurgence of nationalism. And I think it's important to name nationalism for what it is. Because nationalism is the one ideology that allows you to instrumentalize pretty much everything else, right? I mean, nationalism knows no good higher than itself, right? And in the name of making India great, making America great, you can kind of substitute, right? It actually licenses a kind of immobilization of normal checks and balances morality. And one of the questions we need to ask is, why has nationalism become so resurgent in the form that it has again? And my own hunch is that I don't think the explanation is going to be entirely an economic one, that there is something else going on which we hope we can shed some light on in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a debate here about the effects of neoliberalism and the degree to which people benefited at all due to neoliberal policies, and also about what state building has accomplished in the last 20 years in the global South. And also, I have to say something about courts. So there's a lot here to talk about. Some scholars say that the global South is a mirror for the future of the global North. And if that's true, then the continent of Africa gives a very mixed message. As Didi said, the African continent has been part of the global adoption of some kind of electoral politics in the 1990s. So now how is that working out? Okay, so if we look at 2024, we see that of the 19 countries that had elections, five of those elections were postponed indefinitely. 8 dominant parties continued in power, and some of these parties have been in power since the 1970s. Most of them, at this point, now engage in election fraud or intimidation to remain in power. One dominant party survived with a relative majority, and it played by the rules. That's South Africa. It's got its own problems, but a very interesting case. And then we had 5 turnovers, including one party that turned over in Botswana after 66 years in power. So that's really interesting, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But there were 5, Mauritius, Senegal, Ghana, very typical. They often have turnover of the party in power. And then one that no one ever talks about or knows anything about, Somaliland. And that's because we don't recognize Somaliland. But they had a turnover of the party in power, and actually some people think they're run pretty well. Okay, so what's happening here? Democracy, in my view, has been losing ground in Africa since 2016. The majority of the population on the African continent now lives in autocracies. There are 27 dictatorships, 16 countries where it's unclear or they seem to be in transition, but it's not looking good. There are 16 democracies in Africa, it's true, but that's a decline from 23 democracies in 2016. Election rigging, most countries continue to have some kind of election, so I guess that's an improvement over the 1980s. But election rigging is now widespread. We see in a number of countries ballot box stuffing, the registration of so-called ghost voters. They're on the books, but they don't really exist, but they vote and their votes get counted, but they're not real people. There's also vote buying, the use of election violence and intimidation to influence the vote by dominant parties, and then concerted efforts to make sure that people who identify with the opposition just cannot vote or get scared away from the polls. All right, so why are democracies declining in Africa? I agree. There's been a lot of state building that accompanied the adoption of neoliberal policies in the 1990s. But this state building has benefited, I think, a lot of prestige projects. A lot of it has been focused on African cities and building up prestige projects in African cities, hiring star architects to build fancy buildings that often house banks or UN or international donors. A lot of the investment in Africa that has accompanied the adoption of neoliberal policies has gone into extractive industries like natural gas, copper, coal, ruby mines, and these extractive, the development of these extractive sectors and the rent-seeking that accompanies the creation of prestige projects in urban areas and infrastructure in urban areas makes it too unattractive to leave power. Those politicians who have shepherded the development of these projects. And admittedly, infrastructure like roads, hospitals, railways are wonderful things, but they're taking a piece of the action every time something gets built on the continent, and it makes it very unattractive to leave power when you have access to that kind of wealth. I think transnational economic linkages that have come with the adoption of neoliberal policies and increased privatization and more open trade and investment also means that African politicians are able to transfer assets and engage in capital flight without any kind of accountability and without transparency about the amounts of capital that are transferred to offshore tax havens like the Cayman Islands, the Virgin Islands, and increasingly Mauritius. And I wonder what will happen to the democracy in Mauritius, given that it's now one of these offshore financial centers. Much of this has been facilitated, I think, by massive infrastructural investments made by China without any kind of conditions on how money is spent or what kind of political behavior is exhibited by those governments that receive funding from the Chinese. Unfortunately, USAID has already been hobbled for at least 20 years now and has been unable to counterbalance the weight of Chinese investment. The growth of Islamic extremism also explains, I think, the rise of the military in Africa and the high number of military coups that we've seen in the last decade. And finally, economic hardship occasioned by the consequences of a number of neoliberal policies has led to a lot of resistance, a lot of mobilization around the high cost of electricity, for example, the lack of jobs, the growth of mainly the informal sector. And African governments in response have not had a lot of options to offer a large underclass. So their response has been to step up military repression and to use rapid intervention forces and the police to crush resistance. So going back to where that leaves us with the state of democracy and elections in Africa, the worst case scenario is that in a number of countries there will be no elections at all, even though in Mali, for example, they transitioned to democracy in the 1990s and had a pretty healthy-looking democracy in the 1990s. But the growth of Islamic extremism and the militarization of Malian politics means that the military in both cases have, in Mali and Burkina Faso and Chad and Guinea and a number of other cases, have basically said elections are postponed for forever. Mozambique, this is the next worst case scenario, a case where many countries in Africa follow this scenario, where they have a dominant party in power. The dominant party has made a lot of money out of the adoption of neoliberal policies, but it only goes to a small coalition of elites. They don't want to give up power. And so they are engaging in everything they can do: ballot box stuffing, the registration of ghost voters, the prevention of opposition parties from fully campaigning, the prevention of opposition voters from participating in the election. And so the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique in this first panel has won elections repeatedly since 1992. And they were the party that came to power and brought independence to Mozambique in 1975. So rather a long time in power. This year in 2024, they were challenged by a very charismatic guy named Venancio Monlon. The ruling party tried to undercut his efforts to build a party, and he managed to run anyway. And he's led a prolonged struggle since October to realize. Oh, sorry. He's run Monlon has run orchestrated prolonged resistance and a prolonged effort by ordinary people to force the government to recognize what really happened during the 2024 elections. So far it's been unsuccessful, but here is an example of popular mobilization from below that has continued consistently since October. And so you see these images of people in the streets even today. Excuse me, I'm going to have to wrap up because I'm coughing too much. We've got two cases of regular transfers of the party, one transfer of the party in power after 66 years, and another case, Ghana, that has regular transfers of the party in power. These two give me a lot of hope because they suggest that, again, popular mobilization and popular efforts to hold governments accountable are alive and well in Africa. In Botswana, excuse me, the major motivation for the change of the party in power has been economic, and it's interesting to me that a center-left party was elected in the 2024 elections, and we'll see what they can accomplish. Ghanaians, too, confront a lot of problems in Ghana. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of ways in which democracy fails Ghanaians, but they continue in public opinion polls to want democracy and to want to hold their leaders accountable. And finally, I want to end with South Africa. South Africa has every imaginable problem, and it's disappointing in so many ways. But I've got to say, they had an episode of state capture that was as bad as what's going on with Elon Musk right now, and they stopped it. They repudiated it, and it was the court that did that. It was the judicial branch that did that, plus an incredible constitution. So I want to put my faith in the judiciary in the U.S. to act as a check on the spread of executive power that we have here. And I think South Africa is a really good mirror for our future if we want to be hopeful. All right, thank you.
So hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here and a little confused because I'm not sure if I can contribute as much as these amazing panelists. Let me say at the outset, before I get into the substance of my comments this afternoon, that I am not an expert in comparative politics, nor am I an expert in democracy writ large. Instead, I am a scholar, as I believe Professor Slater indicated, of American politics. So I'm going to talk a lot about the American context. And I'm a scholar or a student, as it were, of voting and public opinion, as well as race and politics and black politics. Now, at first blush, that might seem unconnected to some of the comments we've heard already or the broader themes about democracy writ large and what are the factors that give rise to it. But hopefully by the end of my comments, I'll have convinced you that there's at least some connection between those subjects, again, in the American context, and the issue of support for democratic principles, and indeed opposition to those principles as well. So when I was first asked to stand on this committee, or this panel, excuse me, and in replacement for Steve Levitsky, I wondered what I might have to contribute given my particular levels or areas of expertise that I've just outlined. But I think I might be able to give some comments, so I'm going to at least give it a try. As a survey researcher, the first thing that I thought to do was to look at some survey data. Now, in an ideal world, I would be able to give you kind of a deep dive into the 2024 presidential contest with the best data available to do that, which would be the American National Election Study. But as it turns out, that data is not yet available. So instead, I thought, well, let me look at the 2020 American National Election Study to give some insights into support for anti-democratic principles, or perhaps another way of putting it is support for democratic principles. So I did just that. I took a deep dive into the ANES, the acronym for the American National Election Study, and with an eye towards providing some insight as to what are the factors that are associated with support for democratic principles or perhaps opposition to those same principles. Now, some of you in the audience may not be familiar with this study I've made reference to, the American National Election Study, so I'll just say quickly, it is a nationally representative survey that originated here at the University of Michigan in the 1950s and has been running surveys, nationally representative surveys of the presidential contest in every election since 1952, and at least up till 2000, every midterm election as well. So it's got a very impressive time series, most of which I'm not going to comment on in my comments this afternoon. I'm going to focus on the 2020 data set and give you some sense about what are the factors that contribute to anti-democratic principles. Again, this study from 2020 has roughly 8,000 respondents collected online because of the pandemic in 2020, but ordinarily it's a face-to-face survey. All right, so fortunately, I'm just going to give a few examples to illustrate the broader point, but let me just say at the outset that there were several great questions even in 2020. Remember, there had already been an impeachment hearing. We had a second one, of course, following the election. But there had already been an impeachment hearing, and there had already been noticeable and perhaps grave examples of democratic, small d, democratic backsliding, even before the end of the 2020 election, where one of the candidates did not accept the outcome of that contest. But so there's a lot to work with. There were a lot of questions on that survey, and I'll just give you a smattering of them this afternoon. Before I get into any examples, though, let me just give you a preview of what I'm going to find or what I'm going to show. More often than not, the strongest indicator of support for anti-democratic principles, indeed oftentimes the strongest, turns out to be attitudes about race in the United States. So the point, the real big takeaway, if there is one for my comments this afternoon, is for those of us who are concerned about ways to understand and perhaps push back on these anti-democratic efforts, we must grapple with attitudes about race because they are so tightly connected. Indeed, they are probably the most important thing driving them. But I'll say more about that as I move forward. I should say, by the way, before I get into some examples, that when I say race, I mean explicitly or specifically the black-white divide. Now, other iterations of race and racial conflict in this country are obviously important, and sometimes issues, particularly regarding immigration, rise as significant and consequential as well. But there's something about that particular divide that seems to be in the American context, again, at least, that's where my expertise lies, so I'm going to stick with what I know. There's something about that particular division that is connected in a strong way with anti-democratic sentiments. So what I mean here is that even when one considers basic demographic factors, by which I mean gender, age, income, education, region, etc., even when one takes into account other salient divisions in society on the basis of religion or religiosity, indeed even immigration. And even when you take into account partisanship, which is usually the 800-pound gorilla when we do public opinion, at least in the American context. Even when we take into account partisanship and political ideology, whether the survey respondent identifies as a liberal or a conservative, even when you do all of that, attitudes about race rival the strongest correlates of anti-democratic principles and oftentimes dominate everything else in the model. All right, so that's a strong claim, but let me give some examples and then certainly leave time for Q&A, which is what many of you came here for in the first place. So, so one of the questions I examined, and I'll give you the verbatim question here, reads as follows, quote, "For the next few items, we would like to know how important each one is to the United States maintaining a strong democracy. First, how important is it that news organizations are free to criticize political leaders?" Straightforward, perhaps particularly relevant in light of the incoming or the current administration. This question, again, is from not 2024, but from 2020. And even after considering all the variables I mentioned previously, that is to say demographic, I've just ran basic regression analyses here, nothing terribly fancy. Even when you consider basic demographics, religion, religiosity, biblical literalism, the extent to which people are attentive to attending religious services, you take into account partisanship, ideology, the single greatest indicator of opposition, that is to say the belief that it is not important that the free press be able to criticize political leaders. The single greatest indicator is a measure of racial attitudes, specifically what we refer to in the business as the racial resentment scale. It's a particular 4-item survey indicator that is actually developed by researchers here at the University of Michigan, goes back to the 1980s, and it measures, among other things, the belief that African Americans in particular get special privileges from government, and the belief that African Americans specifically do not work hard enough to get ahead. So individuals, now it's not obvious how the belief in those things I've just expressed would be connected to attitudes about freedom of the press, but I assure you they are strongly connected, and they are not merely strongly connected, they are the strongest indicator. All right, there's more. A second question in the battery of items from the 2020 American National Election Study reads as follows. How important is it that the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government keep one another from having too much power? End quote. That might sound familiar to you as well. Again, this question was asked in 2020. Even after accounting for basic demographics, partisanship, ideology, etc., the single greatest predictor of opposition to the concept of co-equal branches of government was the racial resentment scale. Nothing else was close. A couple of kind of running in second and third items would be attitudes about immigration and what we call a 3-item scale that we call white racial consciousness. So it's a combination of white racial identity, the belief that whites are discriminated against, and support for the idea that it is appropriate and desirable for whites to band together to address the obstacles that they face in society. People who believe that, and by the way, a lot of people do, are especially inclined to oppose the notion of co-equal branches of government. In the interest of time, and in part because I want to get to Q&A as soon as possible, I'm just going to mention a couple of other analyses that I ran in order to make the broader point that I'm trying to make here, that attitudes about outgroups and particular outgroups are for whatever sets of reasons, strongly connected in the minds of most voters, at least here in America, when it comes to anti-democratic attitudes or democratic backsliding. This last question that I'll bring to your attention, and I ran analyses on a range of others, so these are not just one-offs or outliers. And I'm not the only scholar to find this, by the way. This is not even a surprise to many people who study these questions, at least in American politics. It turns out that anti-democratic attitudes and anti-blackness go hand in hand in the United States. Indeed, if you're familiar with American history, it shouldn't be a surprise to you, because that has been true for most of American history. Okay, so the last question. In general, quote, in general, how appropriate or inappropriate is it for the President of the United States to ask leaders of foreign countries to investigate political rivals, end quote. That may sound familiar to you as well, because that was the source of the first impeachment of now the current president, Donald Trump. Again, net of the other variables, racial resentment is now, in this case, one of the most important correlates. Turns out it was the second most important, right behind partisanship. It's possible that because this particular question is clearly referencing the then current president of the United States, is done in 2020, and so partisanship kicks in as a stronger indicator. But second in the list is racial resentment. And when I say it plays a role, what I mean specifically is that individuals who score high on this measure of what we call racial resentment are most inclined to indicate that it is appropriate for the President of the United States to ask foreign leaders to investigate his rival. I say his because, well, we're talking about the President of the United States. In addition, by the way, to the racial resentment scale, some other factors that also proved to be quite influential were an indicator of opposition to Black Lives Matter. That turned out to be basically as strong as racial resentment. Now, neither of those have any obvious connection on their face to a question about whether or not it's appropriate for the President of the United States to ask foreign leaders to investigate his rivals. But if you want to know who are the people most inclined to say, yeah, that's a fantastic idea, these are the people who dislike Black Lives Matter. They despise Black Lives Matter. A couple of other comments before I conclude. Because this panel also talks about elections per se, and again, in an ideal world, I would have information on the 2024 election, but I don't because that data is not yet available. But I did investigate the 2020 vote to see what were the factors that were most inclined to drive that decision. Just by way of background, in American politics, the perennial determinant, the most influential indicator of vote choice is typically partisan identification. That we've known that for 70 some odd years. And indeed, in 2020, that still turned out to be the case. But the only other issues that rivaled party identification as an indicator of whether or not people supported Joe Biden in that contest versus Donald Trump were, again, the old standby, the racial resentment scale. In addition to that, Black Lives Matter, and also attitudes about immigration. Nothing else, by which I mean abortion, attitudes about health care, attitudes about the economy, they didn't come close. So it isn't just that race is associated with anti-democratic attitudes in the United States. And as an Americanist, I'm on thin ground in saying this, but I suspect that certainly nativistic concerns play a big role, I suspect, in other advanced democracies. But it isn't just that they are related to anti-democratic attitudes, but they're also heavily immersed in or connected to candidate preferences. All right, so what's the big takeaway here as I get ready to conclude? What should we make of this pattern of association between anti-democratic, small d, anti-democratic sentiments and attitudes about race, specifically Black Americans? Well, again, in the American context, these two sentiments have been linked for some time. Part of the reason that Reconstruction failed after the Civil War is because some Americans didn't think democracy was such a great idea. And so they decided to embrace anti-democracy instead. In the Civil War period, there were several southern states that were actually majority black. And so in a fair contest, sometimes the party of black Americans at the time, the Republican Party, would succeed. That was a bridge too far for some Americans. And so enter Jim Crow. In fact, it's worth noting that even with all our talk about advanced democracies and how they represent an ideal for the emerging democracies around the world, the United States has not been a genuine democracy, at least not for people like me, since about 1965. Not 1776, not 1789, 1965. So for most of the history of the United States, it has not been a democracy, or at least not a true democracy. And if I can leave you with any point before I conclude, it would be the following. If we are serious about trying to combat these efforts, both at home and abroad, to propagate anti-democracy or anti-democratic sentiments, we have to grapple with these nativistic, really anti-black sentiments in the context of the United States, because parties that are motivated to gain power are going to use their efforts to appeal to those sentiments in order to put together a winning coalition. They've done that throughout at least American history, and arguably that's what happened in 2024. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mic is on. Hey, I can hear me. I just want, we have a little over 20 minutes, so I think we have time for people to kind of put their questions together, formulate them. I want to put one kind of maybe a two-part question or observation on the table just to kick things off, and you don't have to answer this right away, but get it in the queue at least. It seems like this year to me, just given just the sheer number of elections that took place and what was mixed bag, I think was the term used a lot, but certainly a lot of body blows for democracy during the year. It seems like a good occasion to sort of think about whether or not elections really are the quintessential democratic institution at all. For some reason, it's the one thing more than anything else that we put front and center, but there's no obvious reason to me why elections are more important than, say, freedom of the press, or say the independence of the judiciary, or some of these other things that are just so vital to making democracy function. And it seems to me that so much of the fate of democracy is about what happens after elections rather than in elections. As Didi put it, same institutions, if there's different people, they're going to function in totally different ways. So we have to focus a bit on the people. So I mean this in a couple of ways. One is that it's just so often the case that we're now having people elected who don't respect basic democratic rights and responsibilities and constraints, that it makes a big difference who wins the election rather than just was the election free and fair. So the kinds of assaults we've seen that Pratap was talking about in India, these are things that freely, fairly elected people are able to inflict. And I would also point to another thing after elections, which is coalition building and the question of power sharing and how elites build coalitions after elections. Because the two countries where I've spent most of the past year have been Germany and South Africa. And in Germany, I was just there Sunday, we had the elections, and it's a totally different world whether the CDU, which wins the elections, whether they say, let's build a coalition with parties of the center and parties of the left, or we're going to build a coalition with the AFD, the party of the far right. Similarly, in South Africa, voters made a big difference. The courts made a big difference. Voters knocked the ANC below 50%. They forced the ANC to go into coalition for the first time. But it's a very different world if they go into coalition with the Economic Freedom Fighters and with the MK, and not with the Democratic Alliance. So some of these questions that come after elections are so vital, it seems to me, that, again, I think it's a good occasion for us to think about maybe there's no reason why a super year for elections should be a super year for democracy, because it's other things that really make democracy function, which is part of what hopefully we can think and talk about. So just wanted to put that on the table. Does anybody want to open things up from the audience? It's a great crowd. So any questions for our tremendous panel.
This is kind of a broader question, but I'm wondering, like, if these anti-democratic values that we're seeing spike in a lot of the countries that were discussed today, if this is kind of, and this might be a misinformed question, kind of an unprecedented spike in values, or if this is part of a larger historical cycle of citizens becoming, I don't know what the word is, unsatisfied with the bodies that govern them.
Thanks very much for the presentations. Just a quick question about the race resentment scale. So I'm just curious if there's a global corresponding scale to this. I understand World Values Survey or the VDEM Democratic Institute Survey does this. So.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll be brief. The racial resentment scale was developed with the American political system in mind, and with so there's no obvious kind of corollary in the, say, Western Europe or other parts of the world that I'm aware of. And of course, even as an Americanist, I know enough to know that there are different outgroups, different stigmatized minorities in different countries. It doesn't necessarily map onto how we conceptualize race in the United States. So, but immigration, really, anti-immigration is probably the closest corollary.
Does this work? Okay. My question is for you, Dr. Hutchings, about the way the racial resentment scale kind of proceeds from here. If the correlation between anti-blackness and anti-democratic sentiments was a function of the kind of events happening around that time, or if you see that continuing as the strongest correlator kind of onward into the future, proceeding from the 2024 election.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and take a little bit to respond in the group? Go ahead. You want to start?
Sure. Very quickly, everything I think I know about public opinion tells me that it's unlikely that 2020 was a one-off. My suspicion is that it's likely to be among, if not the most powerful correlates in 2024 when we get that data. And I haven't gone back to look in 2016, but I would be surprised if that were not the case. In part because we've known that it is the fundamental primary cleavage in American politics, and it has been at least since the Civil Rights Movement.
One thing we might want to do here also is talk a little bit about this neoliberalism, mini debate that was sparking up. I think, Indonesia, I'm dressed accordingly for, Indonesia's elections, but I think it kind of accords with Pratap's point about India, where Joko Widodo, incredibly popular, this notion of a very responsive, common man, developmental approach, despite the fact of lots of inequality, extractivism, and the like. So there's interesting variation here, but I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that also, because that's an interesting, obviously big theme.
Thanks for the question. So just kind of couple of observations, right? One, I think your kind of very interesting question really about kind of what's changed. So I think one of the interesting things about this moment, and I think it also relates to Professor Slater's question about kind of what are we talking about when we're talking about democracy, right? And I have to say the term illiberal democracy is an oxymoron. Because the constitutive conditions of relatively free and fair elections and the constitutive conditions of liberalism are roughly identical, right? So if you don't have freedom of association, if you don't have freedom of speech, it's hard to think of kind of having free elections or having kind of liberal individual rights, right? But I think what makes this moment tricky in that scale, and maybe I'm kind of thinking of India as an example, but I think a lot has been written about different democracies in this context, right? So think of the previous waves of backsliding, 1970s, right? I mean, it's kind of, you can trace that through the career of Sam Huntington. I mean, the Trilateral Commission report, democracy in crisis. And then like a few years later, everybody's writing the third wave of redemocratization. In the 1970s, democracies were in danger in the old-fashioned way. You had military coups, you had formal suspension of, declarations of states of emergency all across the world, right? What's interesting about this moment is most of the places where you have democratic backsliding, they have kept the formal forms of divided government, right? So it's not like they've said, let's abolish the courts, let's hand over power to the military, right? The second thing which they have done, which is actually it's a kind of remarkable way of kind of social control, what we jokingly in India call a way of maintaining statistical innocence. So what do we mean by that? There's no mass arrests, right? There's no formal promulgation of restrictions on the press. All you need to do is, in a sense, a tax notice against 2 television channels, right? And the exemplary effect of that, which again, you can justify in some formal sense, right? So one of the things we're in a sense discovering how much you can use the normal instruments of the administrative state, the liberal administrative state, to actually produce outcomes that are completely contrary to what a democracy requires. And the playbook we see happening right now in Washington is, it's making India look good, frankly. But this is going to be harder to deal with. Right? It's also done bit by bit, which is part of the question of the opposition mobilization. Right? 95% people will go around still saying, oh, well, this NGO got a tax notice. I mean, maybe there's something there will be some procedural remedy to it, right? So that's, I think, the interesting thing about this moment, that you can preserve the forms of a kind of democracy and yet end up with consequences that are the opposite. And I actually agree with you about South Africa in the court. But one of the interesting things about South Africa, what makes it an exception, is so imagine a scenario in which the ANC had unitedly taken on the court, which is actually the typical scenario. I mean, in South Africa, what also mattered was the court was emboldened by the fact that there is not just political opposition, but political opposition within the ANC to Zuma. But if the Republican Party sticks together, like the BJP sticks together, it's going to be harder for courts to do it.
Thanks for these great questions. The elections question is a hard one, and combined with yours, because it's like, what happens to a democracy when you elect anti-democrats and illiberals? And you're absolutely right about this fundamental tension of illiberal democracy. But I think elections are at the very least a necessary and not sufficient condition, or this gets back to a debate in academia about like thin versus thick conceptions of democracy, which is also linked to kind of rising expectations. We don't want to blame the public for expecting too much from their governments, but it's certainly the case that Western governments are in part a product of their own success. Like social democratic parties were, if they succeeded in their missions, then they would kind of stabilize democracy and capitalism, and people would be able to live pretty comfortably, and you don't completely go out of existence, but by achieving some measure of success in building a sort of stable democratic capitalism, it also kind of removed a lot of areas of contestation, and you could start to sort of take democratic institutions and such for granted. So I think the question now for the political left is that it's not necessarily the case that when there's a crisis, or what some people have referred to as a polycrisis today of like multiple overlapping crises, it's not necessarily the case that people reject democracy. But we haven't necessarily seen people's grievances translate into like a political program that parties are then attaching themselves to. So for example, there was a long-time economic theory, the Meltzer-Richards model, that when rising inequality happens, people should want more redistribution, right? And you saw some of this get picked up rhetorically with the 1%, or Occupy Wall Street, but that hasn't really translated into some kind of like coherent program on the left, besides some kind of like what I consider scattershot progressivism in the United States. And so it can create a lot of instability, because then you don't actually get like the typical alignment between people's preferences and political outcomes.
I have a question for Professor Mehta. You said in India that after the election, cool. You said that in India after the election, the BJP consolidated power. With the opposition's ground that they built during the election, why weren't they able to establish a proper opposition? Was it that they gave up, or was there so much repression from the incumbent government that they weren't able to make any progress?
Do you want to go first? You haven't. So the short answer to that, I think, is two things. And one, I think, wanted to relate it to something Professor Hutchings said, right? Which is one of the interesting things that happened with the election. So Mr. Modi returns to power with a coalition government, and many people thought that, okay, this coalition, the fact that he's in a coalition will act as a kind of check and balance, right? But essentially, what most opposition parties have done is they have decided they're not going to take him on the question of Hindu nationalism and majoritarianism. And in fact, you see this strategy emerging in a lot of democracies, right, where actually most parties say, well, we're not going to take the right on directly on that particular question. Now, in India, there's a kind of version of it around the Hindu-Muslim, which actually has the same logic. It is a politics of resentment. Minorities are being appeased, that's the argument. In some sense, of course, there's a longer historical genealogy out of which in a sense that comes, right? And what's worrying to me about India is that for the most part, most of the opposition parties, particularly his coalition partners, the regional parties that in a federalism could act as a check and balance, are simply not willing to take him on that particular issue. So you've kind of done your accommodation. And then it becomes, okay, you know, what economic spoils, how much of the central budget can you allocate us or something like that, right? So that's, I think, one. I think the second, to be very honest, is organizationally the other parties have basically lost the ability. They don't know how to organize. I think there's no equivalent of the centrist version of like what in the US might be a Tea Party movement. Lots and lots of civil society organizations. I mean, I actually still think we are underestimating the importance of face-to-face politics. One of the reasons by which BJP actually grew was actually just by becoming socially much more familiar. I mean, I can give you a kind of long account of how, in a sense, that happened. But the Congress Party is organizationally weak. I think Rahul Gandhi emerges as a slightly more determined leader, but he has absolutely no sense of how to run a political party. I mean, as we speak, one of his most powerful kind of lieutenants is kind of, you know, threatening to defect because they can't decide how to allocate power within the party. So I think, I think we have to kind of go back to old-fashioned things of sort of how do you actually build parties in a kind of environment like this. And simply appealing to the status quo is not going to be a substitute for party building.
I'd like us to get back to talking a bit about the contemporary economic situation. I think that amongst elites in the early 1990s, there was a consensus that free movement of peoples and trade and aid and so forth was going to float all boats. But I don't think that this was ever something that people on the ground in Africa bought into. I think the effects of the adoption of neoliberal policies were very obvious very early on, that the reduction of regulations and a more open trade environment was basically going to result in the import of a lot of cheaply made goods. Now, for a while, consumers, I think, really appreciated that. And certainly, as someone who travels to the African continent a lot, I appreciate having access to all these consumer goods that I never had access when I was doing research there in the early 1990s. But for ordinary people, neoliberalism has led to a lot of job insecurity, a lot of jobs that are mostly informal. There is hardly any manufacturing in Africa at all, and I think this is fed into the discontent with democracy. I was under the impression, until I heard Vince's talk today, that, many Americans also were gravitating towards Trump because they too were very dissatisfied with their lot in life. But it turns out they've just always been racist, and it seems like they're always going to be. That makes me, as someone who grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, I'm not surprised, but I find it really disappointing. But at any rate, I think one of the things we have to confront if we want to talk about how can we save or strengthen democracy is what kind of global as well as national economies can we build that will actually produce sustainable livelihoods for people. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I have some ideas, but it's a huge question.
Okay, so I want to end with a little bit of a speed round. We do have an online question from Andrea Mahu, and I'm going to kind of put the questions together. And what they're asking is, first of all, so what kind of actions do we think might actually help democracy bounce back? And in particular, if we go back to this idea that the democracy is in danger message, well, if you spent time in part of the country where Anne and Didi and I have, this is a dog that doesn't hunt, that given that doesn't seem to be working, so what kind of messaging might get everyone back on the same page? So in terms of what actions, what messages, so maybe 90 seconds to 2 minutes each, what comes to mind as you think the most important actions and or messages? Anybody want to take a shot?
So I'll be a bit contrarian and say it's actually the important thing is not the action or the message, or at least not the message. I mean, obviously you have to act in politics. I think the important crisis is who is going to do it. So the crisis for the Democratic Party in the US, if I can go outside my territory, but equivalent, right, is it's very hard for them to say Donald Trump is lying when most people are convinced that this party has lied about war for a very long time, right? It's very hard for them to say we stand for the common people, right? I mean, and politics is a game of comparative credibility. Why do I trust this person slightly more than this person, right? And so I think the real vacuum is, since you will actually need to have new actors that actually don't carry enough of that baggage of that old regime, which is because that's the one consensus point that seems to be there. Whatever else we want, we don't want that lot again, in some senses. And people like Trump and Modi position themselves as outsiders, right? We are self-made in politics. So I think the question is there something about those party structures that is actually not allowing that, new form of regeneration?
This is connected to what Anne said, and it is a dodge, because every day, if you just read columns in the papers, everyone has a completely different, mutually exclusive strategy for what we should do right now in this political moment. And there are examples where messages have failed, examples where they've succeeded. It's really hard to know. But someone needs to articulate the role and purpose of government at the very least. And one of the problems with this neoliberal consensus is that both parties, or all parties of kind of the center, right, and left, demonized government, and sometimes in very different ways, and definitely to very different degrees. But Dan and I were talking earlier about sort of the center right is maybe our hope right now, that you need new actors potentially to emerge who can say, you know what, like, we may not have made a very good case for governance in the past 30 years. We may not have articulated a role of the state and the things that it does for you. But I think that what we're seeing now is a lot of people who are going to be, fired, confused. They do something really important for the American people, usually invisibly, and, articulating that visibility, being very clear about why you need like administrative capacity, which took hundreds of years to build, apparently 3 weeks to dissolve, is going to be super important for someone to do.
Sure. I think social scientists are often better at diagnosing problems than we are at offering solutions. So in that, or at least I am. So in that vein, I'm not quite sure how to resolve these problems, these important problems we've talked about here on stage. And as I indicated, my expertise is only in the American case in any event. But somehow we've got to find a way to convince Americans in general that addressing the concerns, the legitimate concerns of ethnic and racial minorities need not come at the expense. It need not be a zero-sum game. I don't pretend to know how to do that. That's the million-dollar question. But it is possible to address the legitimate and longstanding concerns of communities of color, and they are many and they are deep. There are ways we can do this without necessarily undermining other populations. I mean, it's possible to do both. And finding a way to make that message stick is the real challenge.
I mean, I think all of my policy solutions are related to reducing inequality. I would say bring back the welfare state. I mean, I thought the welfare state did a really good job of providing a social safety net for people. And I think that where that has occurred in African countries, those countries are having they have a better prospect for the future of democracy. Ghana, Senegal, now Botswana, even South Africa. I hold out hope that South Africa will get its act together. They certainly have a lot of people who care about democracy and are invested in it. But I have to say, the ANC leadership has been really disappointing. So yeah, I would put my solutions in the economic basket.
I guess one thing I would just kind of conclude with is to say that on the one hand, you can say, well, social science doesn't give us this really clear prediction, like, well, if you do this kind of resistance, it'll work, or that kind of resistance won't work. A lot of it's indeterminate. But the beauty of that is it means you can do what feels right. There's no wrong way. If you're inclined to resist, if you're inclined to push in your own way, to push for democracy and against forces that would undermine it, there's really no wrong way to do it if it feels like the right way to do it. It is what democracy is to be involved in politics and sticking up for what you believe in. So hopefully people won't feel like, well, I'm not sure if this is going to work or not too much. You should feel liberated from the idea that social scientists know better than you do, because we do not. So on that note, let me just wrap up. I want to just really quickly thank the teams from both the Center for Emerging Democracy, Zaire, Rosa, thank you so much. Year of Democracy, Jenna, Landon, Ruth, really amazing job. 2 teams working together to put this all together. And most of all to these panelists, is fantastic. Vince Hutchings, Ann Pitcher, Pratap Mehta, Didi, amazing insights. So thank you all for being here on this nice day. There's still some light. Get outside. Get some vitamin A, D. What's the vitamin? D? I don't know. Get your vitamins.